Then you should definitely pick up Richard Schock's Nietzsche. It is much more detailed than I can be in this class, and Schock is for the most part right on. I have very little to quarrel with his account. I differ from him in some places, but it is a substantive work. It is the best in English, and there's nothing in French or in German that I know of that can hold a candle to this work. I particularly recommend that you read Chapter 4, The World and Life, toward a philosophical cosmology, that you read Chapter 5, Man and Men, toward a philosophical anthropology, Chapter 6, Value and Values, and Chapter 7, Morals and Morality. And I suggest that you start out reading Chapter 1, and then go to Chapter 4. Chapter 2 is rather difficult and somewhat opaque, as is Chapter 3. So you should read Chapters 2 and 3 after 1, then 4, 5, 6, 7, and a very interesting and nice chapter, the final chapter, Chapter 8, Art and Artist. All right, there's quite a bit that I want to cover today. Yes?
How do you spell his last name?
S-C-H-A-C-H-T, Richard Schock. Now then, with respect to the eternal recurrence, this he thinks of as a hypothesis, and he thinks that it is plausible, but like any hypothesis, it is not subject to absolute certain rational demonstration from certain premises. It is an interpretive framework in terms of which one understands the facts of nature, our current scientific theories, and which is compatible with those scientific theories. And it's very important that you take note of exactly what role it has in his philosophy. Not a great deal hinges on whether it is true or not. That is not the way he uses it. He uses it in this way that ties up with other ideas in his philosophy. Namely, the idea of order of rank and the idea of the Übermensch that ties in with this, and also his conception of nihilism and what it is to triumph over nihilism. He distinguishes a healthy, transient, temporary sort of nihilism from a destructive and incapacitating form of nihilism that constitutes a threat, a menace to mankind, Western civilization particularly. So those notions tie up in a most interesting way. He asks, and he puts this in the mouth of the demon that comes to you one day and asks you, supposing, this is a hypothesis, supposing, it's like the evil demon in Descartes' Meditations. It plays a similar role. The demon interrogates you, each and every one of us, and you must answer it for yourself. That is very important. Suppose you were to lead your life over and over and over innumerable times, just as you have lived it in the most minute detail. Supposing this to be the case, what would be your reaction? Would you not fall to the ground as most abysmal? And Nietzsche thought it was an abysmal and horrifying thought. How would you relate to it? I mean, would it crush you with despair as a terrible thought that you wanted to dismiss? Or is it the case that contemplating it, you somehow would be able to embrace it and to affirm it, and in this way completely affirm life and nature and your willingness to live it through again? Amor fati, love of your destiny and fate, that you love life that much. That is extremely important notion that you have there for him. Could you do this or not? Each one of us must consider this, and he thinks the vast majority, or a number of people, perhaps the vast majority, would answer no, would be terrified at that sort of a cosmology or metaphysics. But what about some that could embrace amor fati, once more into the maelstrom, into life, to repeat it over and over and over again? This would take enormous strength and courage to be able to do this, he thinks. That there are very few people that could measure up to it. It's one of the tests that he uses for the so-called order of rank of people who differ. I mean, we are not all equal across the board on any measure. And here is one of the things that he wants to establish an order of rank. Some would be absolutely crushed and terrified by it. They could not bear that possibility. Others, well, perhaps so-so, some indifference, perhaps a great deal of ambiguity, ambivalence, and feelings. With respect to still others, there might be those that could heroically and joyously affirm this. For those that do, that would be a measure of the extent to which they were healthily capable of overcoming nihilism. That is the view that life is not worth living, that it is essentially evil. A person that could do that realistically by the description of life that you find in Schopenhauer's The World is Will and Idea, with all of the misery that is entailed in human living, the suffering, history. What is it? As Schopenhauer says, one cat and dog fight after another, perpetuated. The suffering that dominates as a matter of, except that, certain pessimism and realistic view of life, but accept it, but not succumb to nihilism. Still to be able to affirm life for its joys can be eminently worth living in spite of the tragic suffering that characterizes life. And so there you get an order of ranking. There's not an absolute order of ranking on the part of Nietzsche. You rank people with respect to different capabilities and different traits. And you might rank one way with respect to one set of valuations considered intellectual integrity or courage, honesty. You might rank one way on that listing and quite differently on another listing, namely your capacity, as a matter of fact, to be faithful, loyal, and a good friend. People vary with respect to these capacities. The order of rank always is not an absolute order of rank, but an ordering of rank of individuals with respect to different traits, abilities, skills, and so on. So, as a matter of fact, one of the measures when it comes to the question of who is the Übermensch, one of the criteria that you have, not the only one, but one criteria that is important is to what extent would you be able to heroically affirm such a life and your willingness to be able to repeat it over and over and over again. That's a measure of your fitness for life. A measure in part, a measure of the extent to who is worthy of inheriting the earth, who is worthy of life. And that is connected very intimately with the question, who desires it with sufficiently fervor? That, as a matter of fact, that is also a measure of their fitness in part to deal with, realistically, life in terms of what it has to offer us out there. In this connection, I now want to read passages from Schopenhauer's Die Weltausstellung und Vorstellung, in which Schopenhauer lays down the gauntlet and Nietzsche picks it up with respect to his nihilism. Schopenhauer's view is nihilistic, and he lays down the gauntlet and Nietzsche picks it up. From The World as Will and Representation, we have this passage. He has gone into an enormous, horrifying description of life, senility, death, the various misfortunes that lie in store for all of us out there. A very, very grim, but one might say rather realistic picture of what life can be like. And listen attentively to what Schopenhauer says, because Nietzsche is going to pick him up right there and pick up the challenge. This is from section 56 of The World as Will and Representation. Therefore, a philosophical knowledge of the nature of the world, which has reached the point we are now considering, but went no further, could even at this point of view overcome the terrors of death, according as reflection had power over direct feeling in the given individual. A man who had assimilated firmly into his way of thinking the truths so far advanced, but at the same time had not come to know through his own experience or through a deeper insight that constant suffering is essential to all life, who found satisfaction in life and took perfect delight in it, who desired, in spite of calm deliberation, that the course of his life, as he had hitherto experienced it, should be an endless duration or of constant recurrence, and whose courage to face life was so great that in return for life's pleasures, he would willingly and gladly put up with all the hardships and miseries to which it is subject. Such a man would stand, quote, with firm, strong bones on the well-grounded, enduring earth. This is what Schopenhauer says about such a person. But does he think it is possible really to do this? That is what he says with considerable admiration. A heroic figure. This is exactly where Nietzsche says, that would indeed take an Übermensch, a superior man, an overman that could do this, and he's going to take this right up, the very notion that he presents here. And such a man would have nothing to fear. Armed with the knowledge we confer on him, he would look with indifference at death hastening towards him on the wings of time. He would consider it as a false illusion, an impotent specter, frightening to the weak, but having no power over him, who knows that he himself is that will of which the whole world is the objectification or copy, to which therefore life and also the present always remain certain and sure. The present is the only real form of the phenomenon of the will. Therefore, no endless past or future in which he will not exist can frighten him, for he regards these as an empty mirage and the web of Maya. Thus he would no more have to fear death than the sun would fear night. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna puts his young pupil Arjuna in this position when seized with grief at the sight of the armies ready for battle, somewhat after the manner of Xerxes. Arjuna loses heart and wishes to give up the fight to avert the destruction of so many thousands. Krishna brings him to this point of view, and the death of these thousands can no longer hold him back. He gives the sign for battle. The point of view is also expressed by Goethe's Prometheus, especially when he says, "Here sit I, born men in my own image, a race that is like me, to suffer, to weep, to enjoy, and to rejoice, and to heed you not as I." It's not a very good translation of Goethe's Prometheus. And then somewhat later, what does he say about this possibility and about this man? This is what he says: the life of every individual viewed as a whole and in general and when only its most significant features are emphasized, is really a tragedy. But gone through in detail, it has the character of a comedy. For the doings and worries of the day, the restless mockeries of the moment, the desires and fears of the week, the mishaps of every hour are all brought about by chance that is always bent on some mischievous trick. They are nothing but scenes from a comedy. The never fulfilled wishes, the frustrated efforts, the hopes mercilessly blighted by fate, and the unfortunate mistakes of the whole life with increasing suffering and death at the end, always gives us a tragedy. Thus, as if fate wished to add mockery to the misery of our existence, our life must contain all the woes of tragedy, and yet we cannot even assert the dignity of tragic characters, but in the broad detail of life are inevitably the foolish characters of a comedy. The result of this is that the human mind, still not content with the cares, anxieties, and preoccupations laid upon it by the actual world, creates for itself an imaginary world in the shape of 1,000 different superstitions. Hence, this is at bottom most often the case for those people for whom life is made easy with the mildness of the climate and the soil. Above all, the Hindus, then the Greeks and the Romans, and later the Italians, Spaniards, and others. Man creates for himself in his own image demons, gods, and saints. These, then to these must be increasingly offered sacrifices, prayers, temple decorations, vows, and their fulfillment, pilgrimages, salutations, adornment of images, and so on. Anyone who contemplates this life with calmness and resolution must find his heart absolutely rendered. It is not possible for any man to affirm this life as anything but evil. Aha! That is exactly Schopenhauer's nihilism, and it's exactly what Nietzsche says in Beating the Gauntlet. Suppose there were such people, such heroic individuals, that for the joys of life affirm it joyously and are willing to endure all the miseries, the pettiness, the ridiculousness, the absurdity that characterizes this life, still it's able to find it of worth in all of its purposelessness. No purpose, no final aim. Incidentally, note, you people, if you want really to understand the sources of absurdist drama, Ionesco and Beckett, where you start back and look for it is in Schopenhauer and in these very passages. That is that image of life as repetition over and over, in which nothing gets accomplished, no final state at all. And note, with respect to Beckett and Ionesco, tragic comedy. That is life both, to understand it as tragedy and as a comedy. There is a famous politician who said in this connection, who was Acton, I believe, Lord Acton said, life is a comedy to those that think and a tragedy to those that feel. Since we are both thinking and feeling creatures, it's a wonder that we aren't held in the grips of a sort of absolute state of hysteria, ambivalence between the two. Absurdist drama takes this seriously. That image moves over into Nietzsche, but Nietzsche, as a matter of fact, instead of succumbing to nihilism, speaks of the possibility of the prospect of being able to overcome this nihilism. So it's important for him. It ties up with the whole question and test, is it possible, and for whom, under what conditions, to transcend nihilism, that great threat. And it obviously is not an easy thing to do. Nietzsche certainly wanted to do it. That is, and he felt torn in that connection, but he also desired to be able to live affirmatively and heroically. Whether he succeeded or not is another question. He obviously felt he struggled with this his whole life. Now, it's interesting to note, it's with respect to different people out there, it's a matter of sincerity. I mean, here, truth is a matter of truthfulness in saying, are you able, honestly, to be able to embrace this? Are you such an individual? Or are you not? And it says something about you. Incidentally, it is not his intention or interest to convince or persuade. Logic does not have such compulsion. I mean, in this respect, the metaphysics that you elaborate or view of the world is one thing, and your attitude towards it is something else. The world can, with respect to the facts, be the same. We live in the same world, and we might acknowledge the same facts, but how we are going to respond to it will be different. And if you respond in despair, that says something about you. That says something about your life. And in that respect, what may be involved here is not changing your head. How is that going to be possible? But maybe you are just passing sentence on your own life and the way of life, passing judgment on it. In which case then, the remedy might be that you change your life, and if possible, in a different mode of life, might be able, as a matter of fact, to what? To take this step and this step of affirmation. But it's an interesting thing. He is not out to persuade you. No argument could persuade you one way or the other with respect to this issue. And it is very, very important to take note of. That is, if you like, your existential problem. If you have difficulty in coming to grips with this sort of a realistic conception of life and what you would do if you had to lead it over an endless number of times. That is, it ties up with, in an important way now, with nihilism, with the problem of transcending nihilism, and the question, there may be, well, some for whom this is possible. It certainly takes a quite unusual person, and that sort of a person is in part what he means by an Übermensch, a what, higher, superior man. And in addition, he's always talked about the higher men. And with respect to the higher men, he also has in mind a highest. The Übermensch is not a single ideal. That it is not possible to have a single ideal with respect to mankind, their various possible ideals. But one of the qualifications of the Übermensch, whoever he is that he must have that strength and courage to be able to embrace and contemplate this vision, and, as a matter of fact, to affirm it. That is absolutely fundamental. In this respect, he speaks of not merely the quantity of life over and over again. That is not so important. It is the quality of life and how you measure it. And one of the measurements is in terms of its fullness, its richness, and the degree of power that it comprehends. And as we have seen, it becomes very important. This power as mastery, self-mastery, it begins there. Mastery of one's self. And that is of absolute importance. In which he wants to say, because it is interesting, with respect to the so-called will to live. Not everyone has it. Not everyone has it in equal degree. And as a matter of fact, Nietzsche thinks that that is a will to live merely. That is, it's always a will for greater, richer, more powerful, enhanced life. That is what he insists upon. And that he takes as a measure of not only reconciliation to life, but of health. And in that respect, there are expressions of rising, enhanced life, that is growth in power, and of diminution and decline. In this respect, he does talk about art. And he talks about moral systems and religious systems as those that affirm life and those that do as Schopenhauer would do, deny it. I mean, wisdom for him consisted a complete disillusionment for Schopenhauer, and the will turning against itself and denying life. And that can find various expressions. Schopenhauer, then very desperate, asked, how is it possible to have any salvation from this demonic, mad, crazy ball of instincts fighting with one another that constitutes, on Schopenhauer's view, human nature. Human nature as opposed to what? Well, the various types here, note, ascending health and power and descending health and power. The descending is what he calls a mark of decadence. That is, he sees that there are various expressions of this that are seductive, that are beautiful, that are luring, that must be resisted. And that you find this, for example, in art. With respect to Wagner's early work and The Ring, he takes this as life-affirming, enhancing, an expression of power and affirmation of life. He turns against Wagner drastically when he comes in with that silly bit of Christian sentimentalism and weakness that you get in what? In Parsifal. An expression of decadence. You get this in a number of Wagner's works later on. That is, there are certain strains in it. But one finds it elsewhere, where Nietzsche says, with respect to that which lures away from life, that which would affirm death, that which affirms weakness and lures to weakness, it can have a great, subtle, seductive beauty. But it is dangerous. It is dangerous, for one. You remember in this connection, Richard Strauss's Salome, when Salome, who is very life-affirming in this respect, and interested in love, she dances, she sings, she's very life-affirming. Whereas Yochanan, John the Baptist, preaches sin and death, and a movement away from what? A movement away from this life. When his head is brought in on the platter, and she addresses his head on the platter, she says, Das Geheimnis des Lebens ist größer als das Geheimnis des Todes. Aber du hast gedankt, dass das Geheimnis des Todes ist größer als das Geheimnis des Lebens, Liebe. The mystery of life is greater than the mystery of death. But you have thought that the mystery of death is greater than the mystery of life, Liebe, of life and of love. It's a very interesting challenge that is hurled out there. Decadent, beautiful. And the difference between world-affirming music or the haunting strains of what? The latest tone. Latest tone. Sensuality mixed with what? Death. And with love. The attractions of decadent. Decadent. And he's certainly right. It can be extremely beautiful, luring, Swinburne, Algernon Charles Swinburne. Listen to this. It's beautiful. It's silent song. And luring in what sort of direction? Magic. The Garden of Proserpine. Here where the world is quiet, here where all trouble seems, dead winds and spent waves riot in doubtful dreams of dreams. I watch the green field growing, for reaping folk and sowing, for harvest time and mowing, a sleepy world of streams. And tired of tears and laughter, and men that laugh and weep, of what may come hereafter, for men that sow to reap. I'm weary of days and hours, blown buds of barren flowers, desires and dreams and powers, and everything but sleep. Here life is death for neighbor, and far from eye or ear, wan waves and wet winds labor, weak ships and spirits steer. They drive adrift and wither, they will not who may thither, but no such winds blow hither, and no such things grow here. No growth of moor or coppice, no hither flower of vine, but bloomless buds of poppies, green grapes of proserpine, pale beds of blowing rushes, where no leaf blooms or blushes, save this whereout she crushes for dead men deadly wine. Pale without name or number, in fruitless fields of corn, they bow themselves in slumber all night till light is born. And like a soul belated in hell and heaven unmated, by cloud and mist abated, comes out of darkness morn. Though one were strong as seven, he too with death shall dwell, nor wake with wings in heaven, nor weep for pains in hell. Though one were fair as roses, his beauty clouds encloses, and well though love reposes, in the end it is not well. Pale beyond porch and portal, crowned with calm leaves she stands, who gathers all things mortal with cold immortal hands. Her languid lips are sweeter than love's, who fears to greet her, to men that mix and meet her from many times and lands. She waits for each another, she waits for all men born, forgets the earth her mother, the life of fruits and corn, and spring and seed and swallow take wing for her and follow, where summer song rings hollow, and flowers are put to scorn. There go the loves that wither, the old loves with wearier wings, and all dead years draw thither, and all disastrous things, dead dreams of days forsaken, blind buds that snows have shaken, wild leaves that winds have taken, red strays of ruined spring. We are not sure of sorrow, and joy was never sure. Today will die tomorrow, time stoops to no man's lure, and love grown faint and fretful, with lips but half regretful, sighs with eyes forgetful, weeps that no loves endure. From too much love of living, from hope and fear set free, we thank with brief thanksgiving, whatever gods may be, that no man lives forever, that dead men rise up never, that even the weariest river wins somewhere safe to sea. Then star nor sun shall waken, nor any change of light, nor sound of water shaken, nor any sound or sight, nor wintry leaves nor vernal, nor days nor things diurnal, only the sleep eternal in an eternal night. As a boy, when I read that, it's been about 18. The charm, power, the beauty, the siren song of death, all of the imagery there, the preoccupation and obsession with decay, with rot, with senility, with death finally. Powerful literature, decadent. I mean, it is not a celebration of life, but it is a celebration of death and a celebration of life in decline, of weariness, of a sickliness, a beautiful example of, because no man would write that poetry and with that passion, who was not totally enamored and convinced of that vision. In that way, it is an expression of the decadence and decline One might well ask, how many might that well lure? But perhaps why not? In one's weariness, to make an end of it all. I mean, what is the point of it? And why not, as a matter of fact, call it all to a halt? Do you people know how Swinburne died? Well, look it up if you're curious. It's interesting. But here, this literature is an expression of the poet's alive. It is not something that is held at a distance from him. And it says something about him. And those that read it, who can understand it, and you can tell whether people understand something or not by how they read it. Nietzsche is quite right. We live in an age in which people can't read. They don't understand what they are reading, and it becomes perfectly obvious when they read it aloud that they do not know what it is that they are reading. But it certainly comes across very clearly what Swinburne thought and felt, and the passion in which he had, as a matter of fact, that vision. Over and over again, with respect to naturalistic norms, Nietzsche is interested in judging and appraising things, not merely in terms of quantity of life, but the quality of life in terms of that which is life-affirming, which enhances and enriches life, and in terms of that which is life in decline and life impoverishing. And that is where, and he's frequently misunderstood, where he speaks of certain attitudes that people have, certain works of art, of literature, of music, of painting, being expressions of the decadence. And you might ask, in one respect, how do you feel in contemplating or in the presence of such a work of art? Do you ever listen to certain sorts of music? Do you know, as a matter of fact, what is behind it? Do you ever have and sort of relish it in contemplating and listening to the music that arouses profound sadness within you? Of course, most people don't listen to music today. That's not music that I hear beating on my eardrums as I drive down the street with that bang, 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 bang. I mean, those are contemporary narcotics that people have to what? To deaden their sensibilities. They need to be bombarded with sound to distract them from existence and their life. But now I mean certain sorts of music. Some of you, I don't know, you ever listen to anything that today could be called music? In which there is the music that's joyous, marvelous, the great Verdi opera, the Traviata, Trovatore. On the other hand, there's the other thing that engenders that sense of sadness, weariness, pathos, a certain feeling of disgust, the futility of life, of pity for what lives. And before long, you are wallowing in self-pity. And do any of you ever do that? Do you know the meaning and the significance of a siren song luring you away from life? And the difference between art, music, whatever it may be, that is a celebration of life, not a celebration of death. Joyous affirmation, not mourning. Do you see the difference in even the practices of people? How do you celebrate death? all the good Christians out there, many of them, if their faith is correct, why is it not a great celebration? I mean, as they say in the local paper, he's in the arms of Heavenly Father. That's why nothing gets done. I mean, he's got his arms full of a bunch of stinking rabbits so that he can attend to the business that he ought to be tending to. No, I mean that in that respect. So, what about that? And you'd think there would be rejoicing that, what? On the reward, paradise. But there isn't that at all. Makes you wonder how sincere and seriously those people believe what they profess to believe. They certainly, it is not their tradition to do what a different kind of life can do. Celebrate the wake and this person's life and what it gave and meant for us, and a joyous celebration of that life rather than a mourning of it, which is once again an expression of decline and movement away from life. Now, with respect to the doctrine of eternal recurrence itself, I think that is an example of a Gedanken experiment, thought experiment of Nietzsche's that goes awry. It's not that important with respect to his philosophy. One, as a matter of fact, could retain much of it, what is significant and important, without taking seriously the doctrine of eternal recurrence as a true hypothesis. I certainly am quite unpersuaded by it, that it fails of having the status of a secure hypothesis is unquestionable, but not for some of the reasons and criticisms that have been made by various people of that doctrine. Georg Simmel, German philosopher, in his book Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, dealing with those two philosophers, has a reputed refutation of Nietzsche with respect to the possibility of eternal recurrence. The refutation is spurious. It goes like this. He wants to give a model, a mathematical model, to show that the condition even of a finite universe need not, as a matter of fact, return to any initial state within it. The argument of Simmel's is this. You take three wheels of the same size, and you have markings on those wheels' alignment, and you speed the wheels at n revolutions, some arbitrary number of revolutions, at 2n revolutions, twice that, and at n over pi revolutions. And then he says mathematically, you always better beware when philosophers pull out something that looks like a bit of mathematics, because almost inevitably it's going to appear to turn out to be totally spurious. That at those revolutions, the initial alignment will never repeat itself or occur. The truth of the matter is this. I can understand revolution at n revolutions given a natural number, or 2n, but what about speeding at n over pi? Because for one thing, pi happens to be a non-terminating decimal. It is an irrational. That means that it is a number that you can never reach but only approximate, and how far. And if you give pi a specific value, one of the things that you can see even in the abstract it's not true, even theoretically. They are going to approach closer and closer over a period of time. They will get indefinitely close, the alignment, not precisely. But you can't get the precise alignment, which begs the whole argument, because I say, how fast can this velocity be? You can only approximate pi. And if you approximate it, say, to 4 decimal places, say, it's 3.1416, and that's as close as we can measure it and approximate it, then it will align up. It's only if you took it as a non-terminating decimal that it would not. Hence, once again, we see the spurious notion of the infinite, the bad infinite, as they will call it, entering into philosophy. And the argument is spurious. But there are more subtle, in some ways obvious, criticisms of the doctrine of eternal recurrence as a plausible or possible metaphysical scenario, and one that could be supported by science. These are as follows, and some of them you should think about. One, it is obvious, supposedly, that if there is eternal recurrence, and this isn't the first time around, there isn't any first. It is obvious in that respect that there is no recollection or memory of prior existence. And certainly one cannot say that the phenomenon of deja vu, when it occurs, is some sort of an intimation or a hint, though there's overpoweringly the sense that one has lived through all of this before, and you can almost anticipate and expect what's going to happen next, but those people never are able to predict and actually foresee what's going to happen next. It's as though, as it's happening, that sense of experiencing it before. Not all people have that sort of experience anyway, and the experience is subject to quite different sorts of interpretation. And there's some interesting ones. One interpretation of that that's quite interesting is given by Bergson, Henri Bergson. And Bergson, in talking about it, indicated there are 2 different modes, at least, of memory. This is before this was clearly established. There is long-term memory and there is short-term memory. And there's a tendency to deposit in long-term memory and in short-term memory. And that while you are experiencing this, what happens is that it is no sooner played into short-term memory, it's being played, than it is played out of long-term memory. That you get the 2 acting, whereas ordinarily the play is suppressed, is unconscious. It is no sooner deposited as you're living it than it is experienced as a memory phenomenon. That's one explanation of this, and there are others. But the interesting thing to note here is this. What about personal identity? My personal identity is intimately tied up, that is who I am, with my memory. Now, what sort of a connection is there between me, who I am, in this cycle, and the previous cycles? That I should identify, or later cycles, with me throughout all of these cycles. There you have the question of personal identity across possible worlds. In this case, across what? Possible recyclings within the cycle. That is a very important question, personal identity. What is it to prevent me from saying, look, I mean, with respect to those events and those persons, that person looks exactly like me, I might say, in every respect, might even have the same fingerprints. But what would be the difference between that and a genetic clone, which would not be me? It is even, the difficulty with Nietzsche goes even deeper than this. Because on one thing, that seems to be plausible on an old mechanistic, atomistic view of nature that Nietzsche rejects. He rejects it. But that is essential even when he talks about the cosmic dice and the cast of the dice. This goes in with something like a notion of atoms and a finite number of them. And over again through being recombined, the old atomistic conception like you had amongst the Greek materialists, where you had that sort of a conception. That is of things that are beings, exact notion that Nietzsche is attacking, of beings. The atoms are uncreated and indestructible and immutable, hence identifiable. But there is no such thing, including the atoms. Nietzsche rejects that. There are no such immutable, uncreated, indestructible things. What is constant and uncreated and indestructible is force, is energy, force. And matter is only, it is transient, it comes into being. What he says is quite in keeping with modern physics, very compatible, what Nietzsche says here, that they come into being, they pass away. That is, no particle is indestructible in that sense, because when a particle and an antiparticle collide, they're converted into energy, and the individuality of the masses happens to be gone. You know that? And every particle has its antiparticle in nature. And in the course of time, in that respect, nothing endures that's identifiable that way. If you take that view seriously, then that question of my identity does become very important, and the identity of anything else, because what is there to guarantee that out of the finite energy, with its different configurations and so on, that a particular configuration, or any one of them, must emerge and re-emerge in the course of time? That whole view depends upon you having things you can identify that do not change, that can what? Make up a collection, as you get in atomism, and a collection of those things identifiable, and what? Reproducible in the collection. That is just what his physics, his cosmology, which is very interesting and very much in keeping with modern physical notions, that is what he is precluded from doing. So I'm not willing to rule out the impossibility of this as a physical explanation, phenomenon, but it is fraught with problems and difficulties, and the more you think about it, when it is put in this light, the more implausible it seems. And one would have to ask, what sort of evidence do we have, or could we conceivably have, that would constitute either a verification or a falsification of that? But I do this and want to make the point because I am no disciple of Nietzsche's, but when I teach a philosopher, I intend for him to get the best shape that he can get. And I've always done it. And I've had people that have taken classes from me, for example, in the 19th century, and walk away in a week. I know what he is. He's a Kantian. It's as obvious as it can be. Whoops, no, he's a Hegelian. Next one it comes. No, he's a Hegelian. Oops, he's a Nietzsche. Right down the line. Because I try to give the philosopher what he deserves. And in that respect, I have no hesitancy. I don't have time to go into criticism of philosophers in this class, or of Nietzsche. It's hard enough to get you people to understand what is Nietzsche saying, and why, and how it holds together. That is an enormous task. You people ought to be aware of that. We are straining, making every effort to accomplish just that. And so I want to point out, I think that is quite implausible. I've never have taken that aspect of Nietzsche's thought seriously. It's not that important. It is important, you can still, whether it's true or false, supposing it were true, what would be your attitude, and it would still function in his philosophy with respect to the problem in question of nihilism, and the question of order of rank, and introducing the concept of the overman in terms of the ability to face up to that prospect, and it is a test or a measure of how fervently one is able to affirm and passionately this life. And that is its central importance and significance, and it doesn't lose that, even if it should, as a matter of fact, prove to be false. The philosophy is still intact. We have people in this day and age that irritate the hell out of me because people are being educated to do this, who are led to think that if there is a flaw or a mistake or error in a thinker's thought, in his system, it all goes down the drain. It's all or none. So you have these goddamn little pygmies out there that see, a small little what? Little tear here, or incompleteness and inadequacy, and they think the whole goddamn edifice collapses. Well, this is something else. And as a matter of fact, it's just that sort of education that makes people get out there and have no respect for their intellectual betters, and I mean intellectual betters. I mean, they take a course or two in philosophy, and they get exposed to some criticism of Hume or this philosopher or that, and Hegel. And they have general contempt for the whole history of thought. Arrogance, incredible arrogance. That's what we teach students. And it is certainly that attitude that I utterly despise, as though you have nothing to learn from your betters. Well, if anyone cannot recognize in Kant or Hume one's intellectual superiors, so much the worse for you. Much less the case of Nietzsche. Because it is my conviction, I've spent 50 years with him at least, it is my conviction that he is the greatest philosopher of all times. He and Wittgenstein. But with respect to Nietzsche, there is a great deal that he has to teach. And he has taught me a great deal, in spite of the fact I'm certainly no disciple. And there are all sorts of things that I disagree with and I criticize. That does not mean that his writings do not constitute a gold mine that I have plundered all my life and will continue to plunder to my dying days as a testimony of the wealth, and in this respect, not along the lines that seduces so many people to philosophy today. Cleverness, to be clever. One-upmanship. That's what you find all the time. I mean, how disgusting it is to see what appeals to people. That is, they want one-upmanship. So much for me. Cleverness. And what does this whole business mean to them? To their life? Not one goddamn thing. And my attitude towards those people that come into philosophy and dominate it is, I wish to hell they'd get out. I mean, if they cannot connect and relate philosophy to their life every day as they see things and understand it, then it's of no use whatsoever. As Wittgenstein once told one of his students, what good is all your cleverness? What good is it? If it does not mean anything to you whatsoever, it does not relate to your practice and how you live and how you think. I mean, in that respect, those people do a dishonor to philosophy, do go into it, as so often they do, for the wrong motives. I mean, or self-glorification, and to make out of philosophy itself nothing but a prostitute to serve their own ego gratifications. And you have plenty of such individuals out there. I want to take a break for about 5 minutes. Need some water, and then we'll come back and finish our problems with Nietzsche's cosmology and metaphysics. I do not think that they are irremediable by any means, but if anything, they should be apprised and aware of the difficulties that are there. He is greatest as a philosophical anthropologist. I mean, with respect to the conception of man, human nature, and his axiology, his general reflections and criticisms with respect to value, his theory of value, and his criticism of other valuational systems that have arisen historically, and appraising them in terms of the extent to which they are life-enhancing, are life-impoverishing, and the very, very subtle way in which he combines historical, psychological, sociological, anthropological data and analysis with respect to the manner in which valuational systems arise and change. That is his enormous genius. And that is where we owe him a really magnificent debt. He's also very, very creative and very, very suggestive when it comes to the category of life, that is Leben, life, and the centrality that he makes of life and the category of life in his philosophy. And I want to say some things about that. One, once again, he believes that one can give a perfectly naturalistic account of the origin and the rise of life that does not require miracles, supernatural intervention, or deity. In this respect, he sees that there is a certain continuity, not opposition, between the inorganic and the organic world. That is, biochemistry, the chemistry of life, is a very complex chapter in organic chemistry. And there is no real opposition between the chemistry of the inanimate, the chemistry of metals and so on, and the chemistry of living things. He saw that. As a matter of fact, by 1823, Friedrich Wöhler did something quite remarkable in chemistry. It used to be thought, that's why you had inorganic chemistry and organic chemistry, but the chemistry of life was something quite distinct from and irreducible to the chemistry of inorganic compounds, the earth metals and so on. In 1823, Wöhler succeeded in doing something quite remarkable. He succeeded in synthesizing from inorganic materials something that was clearly recognizable as an organic material, an organic substance. He did it first working with ammonium cyanate, and then he backtracking, was able to do a very interesting thing. Anyone know what Wöhler did in 1823? How many of you people have had any chemistry in here? Criminal. I mean, for heaven's sakes, I mean, if there's anything essential for knowing something, it's not really physics, biology, but also chemistry. Anyone know what he did? Well, he took, see if I can remember this. That was the first reaction. Read this to the people, some of you here. Who can read this?
Sodium carbonate,
Sulfate plus ammonium carbonate. What's going to happen to ammonium carbonate now under hydrolysis? It's balanced under hydrolysis. It yields what? Water. And what is this?
Urea.
Yes. Urea. It is the diamine of carbonic acid, urea. It would, you perhaps recognize it, some of you. The symmetry of it. That is amine, the diamine of carbonic acid. That is the bivalent oxygen here. And the monovalent, that gives what? Your 4 carbons bonding. And urea, the diamine of carbonic acid, is urea, and urea is a product of life metabolism, a catabolic product of, and it is found in what? Waste material, urine, yes. That broke down the alleged distinction, and afterwards, in a few short years, Berzelius and a whole group of people, Friedrich Liebig, succeeded in synthesizing the sugars, many of, and the aniline dyes, and many other simple materials. Actually, it's very significant that you get this as a yield. Why? What is the importance of the amine group? It is the building block for what? For the proteins, yes. And as Nietzsche saw it and recognized it at the time, the matter of life was primarily a matter of the complex protein chemistry. And he recognized that. What he did not know, and no one else knew at the time, was the importance of what? The nucleic acids. And that was unknown. And that wasn't known until much later, where you did get the deoxyribonucleic acid and the ribonucleic acid. And these are what? These are nucleic phosphate sugars. Very complicated, sorry. But he knew in this respect that life could arise out of an inorganic world, slowly under certain conditions, atmospheric conditions, that you could build up all of the basic building blocks of life, and under certain conditions, there was no reason why. Very complicated at first protein molecules arose that then were subject to what? Replication, absorbing material in the medium, and then by what? By fission, breaking off, a simple form of reproduction. We see that illustrated with respect to what? With respect to very, very simple bacteria. So there was no difficulty about that at all. Life arising, and then how, by the principles of natural selection, by essentially Darwinian principles here, and variation and mutation, that life would develop from very simple adaptive forms to what? To more complicated forms. There is, in principle, no difficulty in understanding this in naturalistic terms. We still don't know the details of all of this, but I mean, we know a great deal more than we used to, and we certainly see that nothing in principle prevents this sort of an account from going on. But now, at the same time, I want you to see something else that is very, very important. Nietzsche recognizes that nature itself undergoes a certain evolution, and the possibility of certain things coming into being depends upon certain conditions that arise in the course of nature. That is, when temperatures are very, very hot, as they are on the sun and all, atoms of a complex form cannot even form. That is, they are ionized, stripped of the orbiting electrons given the thermal radiation. You people all know that, certainly ought to. In that respect, it takes considerable cooling down, as it took considerable cooling down of the planet Earth to congeal from periods of high heat, before, as a matter of fact, certain simple molecular combinations can arise. That is, complexity can arise out of nature, out of a simpler state of the energy, and differentiate itself only under certain conditions. And for Nietzsche, nature, it can be thought of as rich in its possibilities, in its womb, that it gives rise to genuine novelty of what has not been present in nature before. And this is the doctrine that he develops of emergence, of emergent qualities. And Nietzsche is the first. It is not Hans Christian Smuts, as some people say, or Lloyd Morgan, that originated the conception of emergent evolution, emergent qualities. It is Nietzsche. And what he then says is, look, with respect to chemical reaction, chemical change, you cannot understand that in terms of the older mechanistic and atomistic picture. Don't say that the early atomists had this, because the only type of change that they could account for and explain is the combination of the unchanging, immutable atoms into more complex structures. But the only thing that would give you happens to be mixtures. And a chemical reaction is not a mixture. And to understand actually what's involved in a chemical reaction and a change is precisely to understand that nature is to be understood in terms of configurations of forces, of energy. And why he says this. For example, as you people all know, you have two gases, hydrogen and oxygen, with certain combination of volume. An electric spark in between it, and there is a combination. The structures change. Nietzsche didn't know enough about the details, but enough about his general sort of view that the structure and organization changes, and this primarily is a matter of the manner in which the forces are distributed there. And it gives rise to something new, novel, that perhaps has never existed before out of this undifferentiated force and mass in nature. It is an extremely important notion of emergence. That is, when they combine, these two gases, odorless with all of their qualities, form a liquid, as you know, water, and it doesn't have the properties either of hydrogen or oxygen, nor is it a case of a mixture of the two gases in which something novel comes into existence. I mean, as a boy, I used to love to take and have a vessel of chlorine gas and take out of the oil a little piece of very, very soft, reactive sodium metal, and sprinkle it, and all of the scintillate, and down at the bottom, which I took un grano salis, a piece of salt, sodium chloride. Chlorine, as poisonous as it can be, so is sodium, extraordinarily reactive. When, as a matter of fact, they combine, the properties of this substance do not have a characterized or a mixture of the properties of the other two at all. It's something radically different. Salt, and the significance actually that that happens to have for life itself. So in this respect, it is important to see that it's not just a mechanistic picture of atoms, that older concept, hard, impenetrable things that combine. No, this view of nature, which is the so-called energetics view of nature, not atomistic. Atoms, he thinks, insofar as they might exist, are not immutable and uncreated. They are at best transient, and they involve, as a matter of fact, Nietzsche said it. It's fascinating, some of his insights here. Very, very early, far outstripping his colleagues and contemporaries, when he says in this connection, there is no conservation of matter, mass, which all of his contemporaries believe it. There is only conservation of energy, and mass is but a form of energy. Nietzsche even characterizes it as frozen energy, matter. Of course, that wasn't to be known, anything like that. Nietzsche dies in 1900. In 1905, there is the special theory of relativity. And one of the consequences of the special theory of relativity is there's a conservation of energy mass, but not of mere mass. This formula states the convertibility of energy into mass, and conversely. Nietzsche had no intimation of any of that, but he did say matter in that respect is a form of energy, and what it is, the quantity that is ultimately preserved, is energy that is a measure of the forces. It's a measure of force. It's not the same. It is a measure of force. That is preserved. It is neither created nor destroyed. That first principle of thermodynamics. And it is very important because he takes that quite seriously, and as a matter of fact, that undergirds his whole metaphysics and conception of nature. In this respect, I mean, if you go back to the Big Bang and you ask for what it was that existed, forces in nature, well, we now believe that they were all a single force, unified. That's very interesting because that's exactly what Nietzsche speculated. He speculated that the gravitational force and the electromagnetic force, those were the two known at the time, were essentially and at bottom one and the same force. Maxwell had come along and he had taken magnetism and electricity, and which were two different theories, two different forms of energy, so it was thought. He had, as a matter of fact, unified them under electromagnetism, so that, for example, optics, light, was not a distinct sort of phenomenon and force in nature. It was only what? One aspect of electromagnetism. So that what appeared to be quite different forces, viewed from a certain perspective, magnetism and electricity, are at bottom one, the electromagnetic force. And what Nietzsche said, and it's very interesting, he speculates that there were only two known then. The weak nuclear force and the strong nuclear force were not known. But he speculated that they were at bottom, could be unified under a general theory and were manifestation of one force. But he also speculated that under conditions, they broke off. He didn't have the notion of symmetry breaking, which we have today. He didn't have that. But he did have the notion that somehow the single force could become what? Could be aligned so that there is a possibility of what? Of conflict and opposition within the single force. That is, they could be aligned in such a way that there would be what? There would be resistance and opposition within the single force. But he saw, in order for that to be true with respect to his own theory, it must be the case that there is a sense in which a single unified force can manifest itself under certain circumstances as different forces. That's exactly what we're seeking today. As a matter of fact, we have moved in that direction. What happened with the discovery of the W and the Z particles? You people know what those were? Those are the bosons that were discovered in the 80s. And those are force particles. And with the discovery of them, we succeeded in unifying what forces? Electromagnetism and what? And the weak nuclear force. So that as a matter of fact now we've moved where there's not just electromagnetism and the weak nuclear force, there is the electro-weak force, as it's called. And what physicists are seeking today, and it's very interesting, is what? They are seeking for a unification of the electro-weak force with a strong nuclear force, and then beyond that, those are the GUTs, then beyond that, they want, finally, a unification of that with gravitation. And that's exactly what modern physics is driving full blast towards accomplishing. If they succeed in doing that, there's a lot of skepticism nowadays about extending their generalization, unification that far. But given that, my point is this. Nietzsche has within this notion of cyclical recurrence a state of chaos and disorder. And out of chaos and disorder, gradually over time, order arises out of the disorder, a progressive sort of ordering. And then it eventually passes back into a state of disorder. This is an implication of the second law of thermodynamics in physics. That is the law of increasing entropy. That the energy available for work in a closed system, what? Decreases, never increases. In that respect, he certainly was remarkable and far ahead of his time in thinking this way and saying, look, nature has potential novelty. Creativity is immanent within nature and this process, creativity, innovation. New structures arise that have not existed and could not exist before. The universe had to do an awful lot of cooling down thermally and this planet in order for molecules, and particular molecules of a certain type, organic molecules, could exist. Because with respect to things as complicated as the protein molecules, they are the sorts of things that can only come into existence in an environment very, very narrow with respect to what? With respect to the thermal conditions that will sustain it. I mean, proteins, what? With respect to slight bit of heat, what happens to them? Their whole properties, colloidal properties and everything are gone. But there was a time then when you could see these molecules, these systems, the living, the most primitive early living things, very complicated molecules of a certain sort, could not come into existence. And as a matter of fact, for 10 billion years at least of this universe existence, the conditions were not there. Suddenly the conditions arise, and then, with that notion of emergence, we see something totally unpredictable, unexpectable emerging. It's not that it has no explanation or causal explanation, but it finally emerges, and one says, remarkable, who would have thought that was possible within nature? Nature is thought of as creative, extremely creative with respect to the diversity of its forms. Evolution illustrates, as a matter of fact, a part of this process. And the concept of nature as creative, rich, diverse, and bountiful is very important in Nietzsche's philosophy. And in that respect, he opposes any reductionism. That what is new and comes into existence as water is something that has properties that are not reducible just to its elements, to hydrogen and oxygen. I mean, new system and new properties that emerge. In this respect, too, he wants to say that there is no sharp borderline, obviously, between the living and the non-living. That's sort of an antithesis. That is, there is a gradual and there's an intermediate area where we're not even sure whether to call that living or not. And then eventually we do reach a point with a bit more, what? With a bit more complexity and organization. that is life, but very, very primitive forms of it, in which certain properties then are exhibited, such as responsiveness and sometimes to certain stimuli, like touch. The amoeba is sensitive to objects and moves back when it encounters resistance called the pseudopodia. In this respect also, very simple and early forms of life are what? Sensitive to such stimuli as light, moving in the direction of it or away from it, as you get in the very, very primitive sort of thing that's between animal and plant. I call it a planimal, between an animal and a plant, namely the Euglena viridis, with that little bit of green in it, and a relative down the line that develops a little red spot. And both of those are like eyes. They are responsive to light, and the organisms will move. There's a tropism will move in the direction of the light or away from it, depending on the circumstances. But these are qualities and properties of certain complex systems that arise in the course of chemical development, emergence. It is not miraculous in that respect. It is gradual, and one can also say in this respect that reaching a certain level of complexity and organization of a living animal system, there arises the possibility of consciousness. And that is what a characterization of a certain complex organization of forces in nature that is lacking at earlier stages. But in this respect, it is a view of, it is not mechanism, and it is not simple atomism. It is much more sophisticated than that, with the notion of systems that arise here, structures. Systems, structures of varying complexity that arise in the course of nature, in the course of history, that exhibit new properties that did not exist before, and those properties are not reducible to the properties of simpler systems. That is, consciousness in that respect characterizes a certain level and degree of life, and it does not characterize earlier forms, and it isn't just something that is a rearrangement, a mechanistic rearrangement of earlier forms. And that is very, very important to take note of. His view here has enormous significance. With respect to life itself, he rejects the notion as a myth of mere self-preservation, the instinct of self-preservation. It is characteristic of life that it grows, it appropriates. And this is very, very important for Nietzsche. Life is not something that is merely reactive and adaptive and passive. It is activity. It is directed towards action. It is a dynamic system. And it endeavors to expand. In that respect, there is a drive for appropriation, for more, for growth. He sees this in living processes right up and down the whole spectrum. You take a culture dish with agar in it, and you put in even single cells, whether it's bacterial or others, and the process of life involves appropriation, assimilation. It takes what is not itself out of the environment, and by these metabolic processes and so on, converts it into itself. But it doesn't merely take enough to maintain itself in terms of output, expenditure, and input of energy, so that you have a quiescent, stable sort of system. It appropriates more than it can assimilate, and more than it can organize in its structure. And as a matter of fact, this is what results then in a phenomenon, almost as an outgrowth of it, a very, very simple reproduction. In appropriating from it, it cannot manage the bulk, and it undergoes what? It undergoes a fission process. That is reproduction. And that, he thinks, is at the very heart, as a matter of fact, of the phenomenon of life. And that is why he says, no, there is this nisus, this thrust in life, which is a creative sort of thrust. That's very, very important, in which the individual living forms transcend themselves. You take, as a matter of fact, with respect to any environment, plant something, whether it's plants or animals of sorts, and they will proliferate, they will grow, they will encounter resistance, and they will, when they encounter resistance, the growth goes in what? In the direction of least resistance, and where it can appropriate from the environment the raw materials, assimilate it to itself. Reproduction, growth. That is why he says it is conatus. He uses Hobbes' terms, and the term that was also in Spinoza. Conatus, that is a nisus, a thrust, an urge to transcend the individual and the individual living thing. That is what it wants, and he says this is characteristic of life. It appropriates, it dominates, it assimilates into itself, and endeavors, as a matter of fact, to what? To reproduce itself. As a matter of fact, you can put it this way, I mean, the system always appropriates more than it can manage, that it can dominate. Always does that. And the result of it is, having appropriated more, it what? The system splits off, reproduces its own kind, multiplies in this respect until it meets resistances that it cannot overcome. That is a very, very important notion. He ties it up with a lot of things about ourselves. That self-preservation occurs only with a life form that is in distress. In distress, great emergency, does it resort to what? Self-preservation. And then the determination to live, the mere will to life. Otherwise, it's not mere will to life, but to what? But to greater and greater life, power, more and more, enhanced life. That is the doctrine. That is what lies at. We're going to have to start looking very carefully both at life, in its philosophical anthropology, and the notion of the will to power. Life and death go together. They're not just antithesis. That we are continually in a state of dying as well as living. That if the process of growth, the impulse, does not overtake the process of decay and death, the equilibrium of the organism ceases and there is death. That is, we are in this process not only assimilating, making stuff in the environment, the living organism, into ourself, we are also excreting, we are throwing off waste in the process. The anabolic process of building goes along with the destructive process of what? The catabolic processes. And the catabolic processes, if they exceed the anabolic, result in the death of the organism. But the anabolic always, he's saying, is outreaching the catabolic processes. If you don't, as a matter of fact, escape, and this is what happens in the environment, I mean, in some ways, the product of living, that is of decay, the waste, if they accumulate, they what? Kill the thriving organism. There must be a way of removing, as a matter of fact, the waste. Eliminating it, removing it from the environment in order to make life continue to prosper and grow. So in that respect, the process of life and death, the process of growth and the process of decay go on, as a matter of fact, simultaneously. What is interesting about life is, that excess, this is connected with Kunatas, of the anabolic process of growth tending to outstrip the process of decay, and it is this that leads to the simplest forms of reproduction, such as in fission. That is very, very interesting sort of notion. Nietzsche says, distress, mere preservation. When there is not distress, and under healthy conditions of growth and the possibility of growth, there is always the tendency to what? To transcend its own form and to change. That is, there is an imminent conditions of imminent impulse towards growth which makes possible change and change into new forms. And he thinks this is very important. Distressed people try to conserve themselves and preserve themselves under conditions of great distress. The healthy are overflowing with excess energy, strength, and there is the tendency to expend it, to discharge it. And that is very important. That ties up very interestingly with the notion of will to power. That is, it's not merely a hoarding, that process, but of expending and giving out of fullness of one's power and strength. In this connection, with respect to the vast majority of mankind, I mean, you don't need to urge them to live dangerously. They do so. They take risks that they know all the time that imperil their lives, and do it gladly, for the thrill, the sheer joy. Racing, mountain climbing, adventure in foreign countries. Much of the appeal of the West and unexplored territories. New peoples to what? Come into conflict with, appropriate. What is the history of mankind? There's an interesting series on right now with respect to the West. What is that called? Have you people been seeing it on PBS? Western Experience. I can't think of the name of it now. But you ought to look at it. I think it's going to be on tonight, tomorrow night too. It certainly is interesting about our history. What sort of people we were, and the relations, as a matter of fact, with the Indians. Don't gloss over your history. The truth is goddamn ugly. And true history is as ugly as it can be. Because it says something about who we really are, what we are, about humankind generally. And I suggest that you read that and look at it very carefully. But it is true. One takes all sorts of risks. I used to be much more daring as a child. I knew that I was doing things that were terribly dangerous when I was titrating phenol, trinitrophenol, and playing around with things like methyl bromide and so on. It's a wonder that I wasn't dead by the time I was 12 years old. It was exciting and thrilling, and I knew the risk. The trouble is I grew older as a result of civilization taking hold of me, my training and all. I became excessively domesticated and tamed. I don't take risks today. An idea of people say, oh, Fred, what about going out skiing? And oh, horse shit. Might break a leg and all sorts of things and so on. And I'm not one for any mountain climbing. The exhilaration and thrill of mountain climbing, I'm not going to take any risks like that. Or racing automobiles and so on. I've become a milquetoast. There are others of you out there that for whom this isn't true. And it might be said of me then, certainly in my present condition, now you take Hagen. That is a good example of declining life, of a decadence that would hoard and hold on to preserve itself. He doesn't dare go out there and take the risk. He doesn't throw down the gauntlet to life in these ways. There are subtler and more refined transgressions. And I cannot say that I have been completely innocent on that score. That's why my discerning students, the smart ones, people I've known over the years, always had the uncanny sense that there was something sinister about this one. But that isn't true, isn't it? Look at this smile. All right, so much for